Up next, our NC Voters for Clean Elections. Super excited. Melissa Crum from that organization will be coming to give a national perspective on how protests are being attacked across the nation. So this isn't just North Carolina, it's a national issue, right? And so they'll be, explaining how they're going to, coordinate efforts and advocacy around this. And, this organization really works to improve the vitality of democracy in North Carolina. So they fight for things to be transparent. They fight for things to be voter owned, as it should be. And so we're just super excited to have them join us this morning. And so I see Melissa is on. So thank you so much for being with us. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Price Crum. I'm the director of NCVCE. We are a pro-democracy coalition that has been around for over 21 years here in North Carolina. And we've been tracking and advocating on the protecting the right to protest for several years now here in North Carolina and across the country. But today, I'm here to talk about the history and recent national trends in the anti-protest legislation attacks. Since January 2017, we've seen a staggering 228 pieces of legislation attacking the right to peacefully protest. 45 states have considered protest legislation. 36 pieces of legislation has been enacted, and 53 anti-protest legislation is currently being considered in states across this country right now. Now, these anti-protest bills increased exponentially after the murder of George Floyd last year, which sparked demonstrations across the country and amplified national attention to racism in police practices. In fact, media outlets deemed last year the year of protest. And since then, there has been twice as many proposals to quell peaceful protest in the 2021 legislative sessions across the country. And we've seen them here at home in North Carolina. So recently, when I stood up in a North Carolina committee hearing on House Bill 805, North Carolina's very own terrible anti-protest bill, I had to speak truth and say that these were, anti-Black Lives Matter bills, because that's clearly what they were. Now, the First Amendment guarantees both free speech and freedom of assembly, and it is a mechanism for responding to deficits in the functioning of other rights. As many rights have come under attack, recently, many people see peaceful protest is the only way that their voice can be heard. In other words, the reason why so many peaceful protests exist in the first place right now, whether it's the civil rights era or today with the Black Lives Matter movement, is that Americans are trying to change things about our society and our political system that are fundamentally broken. It is important to understand that all these anti-protest bills that we're seeing right now are an attempt to maintain the status quo and prevent significant change that would lead to a more equitable system in our country. Now, these anti-protest laws that are growing across the country in the past year are not about protecting the peace. They are about silencing dissent. Now, I want to say that one more time. They are about silencing dissent. And the thing is, elected officials are supposed to protect even the speech they don't want to hear. But alas, here we are. Now, states with robust protest activity should have one priority: listening to the people of their states, to their constituents. Instead of lending an ear, we're seeing them impose a silencing hand. In an era of historic activism, this response isn't just unconstitutional, it's fundamentally un-American. The surest way to end protests against racist police violence is to end racist police violence. So, all right, guys, I'm going to talk about a couple of the key elements of some of the bills that we're seeing across the country. I'm going to pop into the chat. You can check out this website, And you can actually follow along and see some of these. Let me make sure I have it right. But yeah, this is the US protest law tracker. So you can actually see so where some of these protest bills are going across the country. So some of these bills are about broadening the definition of a riot or creating a broad new offenses for disorderly protests. So, you know, in some states we've seen things like, okay, well, 2 people are just a gathering, 3 people's a riot. All right, we've seen steep new penalties for riot and related offenses. We've seen steep new penalties for protests that block roads, sidewalks, and other passageways. We've seen that in North Carolina before too. Steep new penalties for protesters who deface monuments and other property, because suddenly we have to protect these monuments. And we've seen this in North Carolina, right? Steep new penalties for camping, which is really broadly defined and would cover like 24-hour protest on state property. Collective liability, the RICO liability for conspiracy to engage in protest-related offenses. We've seen disqualification for unemployment and other public assistance benefits for individuals involved in protest-related offenses. Even one state was like, even if you just get charged, you could lose this. We've seen mandatory minimal penalties and denial of bail for protest-related offenses. We've seen creating a new legal defenses for individuals who used deadly force against protesters. Criminal and civil immunity for drivers who injure or kill protesters. We saw that here in North Carolina a couple of years ago. It didn't pass. New right of action against state and local governments and officials for failure to enforce laws around riots and protesters. We saw that this year. So if you guys want to check out the bills in North Carolina, you'll notice that we have defeated 8 bills so far. We have 2 left that are pending. So I was going to do a little bit of some of the history of this in North Carolina. So I'm going to start with my favorite one. It's at the bottom of the page if you want to scroll down. So it was House Bill 249. So this was the economic terrorism bill. So basically what happened, if you remember, it was like April 2017, a couple years ago, we saw the Charlotte Black Lives Matter protest where people were getting out in the Charlotte highways. So they filed a bill and they basically, I think this was, all right, it would have targeted protests that obstruct roadways by newly criminalizing economic terrorism, defined as the willful or recklessness commission of a criminal offense that impedes or disrupts the regular course of business, yada, yada, yada. You can see it all right there. Yeah. So we saw this come up in committee. I had to go run and deal with another judicial independence bill. This bill actually died in committee by 1 vote. So next we saw Senate Bill 229. This is heightened penalties for threats against former officials. Evidently, there was some claim that it was sponsored by Dan Bishop, who's now a congressman, had pledged he would introduce this because evidently there was over inauguration weekend, evidently protesters shouted at Pat McCrory. And so they wanted to, this was defeated. Okay, and then we have House Bill 330. Again, this was 2017. This was, it goes back to Black Lives Matter and them going out into the streets. And so this was eliminating driver liability for hitting protesters. We've seen this one across the country. And basically, one could argue that it could encourage people to basically run over protesters. We saw House Bill 966 in 2019, which put limitations on teachers' ability to protest, defeated. And Senate Bill 238 in 2021. Okay, now we're getting into the ones we defeated so far this year. This was a local government liability for lax law enforcement in response to protests, because they basically were thinking that some of these cities were not dealing with protests the way they thought they should, the legislators. House Bill 321 was criminal and civil penalties for officials to withdraw during protests, again, defeated. There was, House Bill 333 was, we just basically increased penalties for campus protesters. Senate Bill 335 was basically a way to heighten penalties for protesters who disrupt meetings. So again, this falls under the category of the ones that they're increasing penalties. Currently, we have a couple bills pending here in North Carolina. We have Senate Bill 300, which has been mitigated. Some argue like the riot provision in that bill has actually been made better, so it's really harder to charge. I know some other groups will be talking about that one later. And then we have House Bill 805, which basically, this is Speaker Moore's bill. We saw last fall, he was upset about the Black Lives Matter protests. He was out in the streets of Raleigh filming this. And this was his way of saying, okay, well, we're going to do something about these Black Lives Matter protests. Let's just be honest. This is one of the worst anti-protest bills we've seen so far. And it's already passed one house. So it's sitting in the Senate right now. And so again, to sum up, what we've seen in North Carolina are bills that would mandate criminal and civil penalties for officials who withdraw police during protests, establish new penalties for campus protesters, penalize local governments if they don't use enough law enforcement, and heighten penalties for riot and other offenses. I know some other groups are going to go into some more detail about House Bill 805. I do want to point out one thing. When it does have to do, it's increasing the riot provisions and deal with incitement to riot, civil liability. There's some bail issues, assaultment on law enforcement. But on the House floor, when this bill was heard, we had Representative Lofton put forth a House floor amendment, which he thought was clarifying what an overt act in a riot is. But the problem with that is no one really knows what an overt act is. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more now that you've got the picture of North Carolina, what we've seen going across the country recently. We've seen a proposal in Indiana, for example, that would bar anyone convicted of unlawful assembly from holding state employment, including elected office. Wow. We've seen a bill in Minnesota that would prohibit those convicted of unlawful protesting from receiving student loans, unemployment benefits, or even housing assistance. Now, the worst bill that we've seen by far this year is Florida. So the Florida governor actually this is passed, it's signed into law. The people are challenging it in courts, just to be clear. But what this law, which again, many deem this is the worst anti-protest measure in the country. This is why I'm going to focus on this one. The law was, again, clearly written in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, in response to the murder of George Floyd. It basically provides these new protections and increased penalties for people who take part in what they consider property damage or violence during protests. Now, Florida experienced little of this, as we saw elsewhere in the country, but still they felt like they needed to do this. Governor Santos said that, tougher laws were needed to make sure Florida doesn't see the kind of protests we saw in Minneapolis, in Oregon, and other cities. And then, in this clever sleight of hand, and I have to put this in because this is just so wow moment. So we knew that they were doing this bill in Florida all last fall. And then this very clever sleight of hand, and you're going to see other states do this. The speaker, I put it into the chat so you can read it for yourself. He put out a statement basically trying to say that their massive anti-protest legislation package was actually meant to address the riots, like the insurrection at the US Capitol. Yeah, I know. All right. We all knew. We all knew that they were planning this bill months prior as a direct result to the Black Lives Matter movement. In fact, North Carolina actually tried to use this argument. And we're like, no, no, no. Anyway, back to Florida. The law in Florida increases penalties for protesters who block roadways or deface public monuments. It creates some new crime called mob intimidation, and it requires that anyone arrested at a protest be denied bail until their first court appearance, which was going to very highly, this is what we're seeing in other states, make overnight jail stays. The law also makes local officials in Florida liable for lawsuits from injured parties if they are found to have not done enough to respond to violent protest. And it reacts to the defund the defund the police movement by allowing officials to appeal to the governor and his cabinet any decision by local officials to reduce funding to law enforcement. We've seen versions of that in other states too. That is not always wrapped up into anti-protest bills. Sometimes those are separate, but I would be watching out for those too. So again, many have said the Florida bill is an unconstitutional attack on free speech, and they're challenging these in courts. It was very clear that the goal of the Florida law was to silence dissent and create fear among Floridians who want to take to the streets and march for justice. Bottom line, free speech, the right to assembly and association stand at the core of American history and democracy, from the revolution to movements for the abolition of slavery, to universal suffrage, to the civil rights and equality under the rule of law. Now, the protest rights have faced, again, an onslaught of restrictions over the past couple of years. This bears repeating. I know the US protest law tracker I sent it actually has 227. We just got word of another bill. So 228 pieces of legislation since January 2017. 45 states total are considering these bills. 36 pieces of legislation have been enacted, and 53 anti-protest legislation is currently pending. However, we can do better. We can work to pass pro-protest legislation. Now, this is a budding field here in North Carolina, and I'm so excited to talk to you about this because, you might feel helpless, like, what can I do? But you can actually work with your states or your local municipalities to pass pro-protest legislation. All right. First one is restrictions on less lethal weapons. Now, when used in context of protest, certain types of less lethal weapons like tear gas, rubber bullets, and sonic weapons are indiscriminate by their very nature. So these weapons should never be used in the context of First Amendment assemblies. We're going to talk a little bit more about these and how they work. So one of them is tear gas and chemical irritants. Now, the 1925 Geneva Protocol and the 1994 Chemical Weapons Convention prohibit the use of agents like tear gas in warfare, yet they remain a tool somehow in the United States law enforcement agencies. And so when they're deployed via like large scale canisters, tear gas, chemical irritants, they can do indiscriminate harm. And so we've seen 6 states, 12 municipalities pass laws kind of prohibiting these. There are also versions of this pending at the federal level. 18 states have pending legislation and 3 municipalities. And guess what? North Carolina has pending legislation on this. I would like to give a shout out to Representatives Katie Smith and Zach Hawkins for filing North Carolina's House Bill 589, which prohibits the use of chemical agents on minors. Now, as a mother whose child did get hit with a chemical agent at a Black Lives Matter protest, I wholeheartedly agree with this. So again, House Bill 589. We've also seen, a couple of these bills at the not pass, but again, we've seen 6 states, 12 municipalities. If you want to do something good, go talk to your local municipalities. See if they want to pass something like this. I'm going to pop this into the chat, and you can learn more about or follow me along as I talk about these. Or you can email me and I can see what I can do to get you. I'll give you my email address in just a second as I go through all of these. Another one is rubber bullets and less lethal projectiles. Now, rubber bullets and other less lethal kinetic projectiles you've seen, they cause serious physical and psychological harm on people, and they should never be used in controlled crowds at demonstrations. So we've seen 5 states enact these policies, 5 municipalities enact them, and guess what? You can enact these at the local level. And they've been proposed in 15 states and 4 municipalities. All right, sonic weapons. Okay, these long range acoustic devices or sound cannons can be used like sonic weapons, emitting loud, very painful noises that can cause long-term hearing loss. Now, human advocates have called for the suspension on their use in like for police to control crowds until their effects are better studied. In fact, the City Council of Seattle, Washington, prohibited the police use of acoustic weapons against crowds. And the mayor of Portland directed police to only use sonic weapons as a communications device and not use their sonic like warning tones on crowds. So, I know a lot of other groups that might talk about this, but I want to talk a little bit about the restrictions on transfer of military weapons to local law enforcement. We've seen them used against protesters. So as we know, local law enforcement has increasingly used inappropriate and intimidating military gear to police protests, including like grenade launchers, armored vehicles, military drones. You've all seen it on the news. The militarization of local law enforcement is partially the result of the federal government's 1033 program, which basically allows the transfer of weapons and equipment from military to local law enforcement. Now, we've seen several places enact policies to basically prevent or stop this. So we've seen Washington, D.C. actually enact legislation that banned the city from acquiring this military equipment. We've seen Virginia our neighbor, Virginia, enact legislation that prohibits law enforcement agencies from acquiring weaponizing drones, combat aircraft, grenades, grenade launchers, standard issue military rifles, combat figured like the armed vehicles, camouflage uniforms, all those things you've seen. We've seen California introduce a bill. Hawaii is considering legislation. We've seen Madison, Wisconsin pass similar, the city council passed similar legislation. We also want to look at the restrictions of surveillance technology. Police force have inquired increasingly sophisticated surveillance technology, aerial drone surveillance technology, facial recognition technology. So in response, we've seen cities from across the nation, such as Nashville, Seattle, Oakland, they basically adopted like community control over police surveillance legislation. And so we're seeing this pop up in like New York and Massachusetts, Virginia. That's another tool in the toolbox. We've also seen some of this at the federal level being proposed. Another way to actually look at protest work is reforming public order laws. Public order laws, such as like unlawful assembly, disorderly conduct, riot, these have overbroad provisions and are often used to arrest peaceful protesters. And so we've seen several states start to introduce bills to like better target these laws and limit their abuses. And so we've seen that moving across the country. We've seen bills to repeal anti-face mask laws. So 17 states currently have anti-face covering laws. And, we've started to see, obviously with COVID, we saw some like pullbacks of that, but, one of the tools in the toolbox would repeal that. Requiring officer identification is another tool in the toolbox. Several states are looking at that. So yes, you can, work with your local municipalities to push protest legislation. I put my email in the chat if you would like to talk to me about doing it at a local level. I can help hook you up with some information regarding that. But the bottom line is the right to protest is fundamentally American, and it's a critical part of our inclusive democracy. It is a form of free speech and direct political engagement necessary to produce change. Now, protests have ended Jim Crow segregation. Protests have given women the right to vote. Protest has legalized gay marriage. Protest has ended wars and brought our troops home. Protests are an effective and peaceful way to move our country forward. But since 2017, when our countries began seeing more protests, we've seen, all of these anti-protest bills cropping up. And what we're seeing right now in the Black Lives Matter movement is a reminder of how important the right to protest is to achieving a government that works for us all, not just the rich and powerful. So it is, what I want to close on is, you have a constitutional right to protest. And these anti-protest legislations that we're seeing across the country are not only anti-free speech, they are anti-democracy, and we will not be silenced. Thank you for having me here today. I'm happy to follow up with any of you guys if you are interested in fighting to stop the anti-protest bills at the state level, or if you want to go and work at the local level, your municipalities, in passing pro-protest legislation.
Ooh, thank you so much, Melissa, for that. That was amazing. I mean, I think, what I got out of that most was just the opportunity for strategy. And so just super thankful for you coming on and to also talk about the inner workings of what led to this in North Carolina's history. Sorry, you all, we have a visitor who also is wants his right to protest to be protected. My apologies. But but really thankful for you and coming here and explaining that. I mean, that was simply amazing. Joe, what you think?
No, thank you so much. Like, that was super informative. And I just love how you kind of laid out the timeline, right? Because we do need to really hound on the fact that this is not the first attempt by any means as trying to strip our voice. And so I just deeply appreciate the work that you do, you coming on and explaining that out for our folks today. We definitely appreciate you. So thank you so much for being in space.
Yes.